In the world of elite marksmanship, there are legends whispered in shooting ranges from Texas to Tennessee. Stories of impossible shots made under pressure that defy logic and physics. But none compare to what happened on a foggy morning in 2019 when a quiet woman from rural Montana walked into the most exclusive shooting competition in America. The veteran snipers called her attempt mathematically impossible. The wind was gusting at 25 miles per hour. The target was 1,847 yards away, over a mile of open ground. The morning mist made visibility nearly zero. Even the most decorated military marksmen had already given up for the day. But Sarah Chun had something they didn't expect. Something that would make her shot not just successful, but legendary. Something that would force the shooting world to rewrite the rules about what human precision could achieve. What happened next lasted only 3.2 seconds, but the ripple effects are still being felt today. Because sometimes the most extraordinary moments happen when no one is watching, and the only proof is the undeniable result that follows. This is the true story of the shot that shouldn't have been possible, told by the woman who made it and the witnesses who still can't believe what they saw. Sarah Chun had never intended to become famous. At 34 years old, she lived quietly on a 500-acre ranch outside Billings, Montana, where the nearest neighbor was 12 miles away, and the sound of her rifle was just another part of the morning routine. Her life revolved around predator control, protecting her cattle from wolves and coyotes that wandered down from the Beartooth Mountains. Most people who knew Sarah understood her as a practical woman. She drove a beat-up Ford pickup with 180,000 miles on it, wore the same faded Carhartt jacket year-round, and spoke in careful, measured sentences that never used more words than necessary. Her Asian features stood out in rural Montana, but after 18 years in the area, she had earned respect through competence rather than conversation. What people didn't know about Sarah was the extent of her precision with a rifle. Every morning at dawn, she would walk to her shooting range, a cleared stretch of land that extended nearly 2 miles across a valley between rolling hills. The range wasn't much to look at, just wooden posts marking distances and steel targets of various sizes scattered across the landscape. But Sarah had measured every yard, calculated wind patterns for every season, and documented the ballistic performance of her custom rifles under thousands of different conditions. Her daily routine was methodical. First light meant coffee and weather assessment. Wind speed, direction, barometric pressure, temperature, humidity, all factors that would affect bullet trajectory over long distances. Then came equipment inspection, rifle maintenance, scope calibration, ammunition preparation. Only after these preparations would she begin shooting. Sarah's father had been Marine Corps sniper in Vietnam. He returned home with stories he rarely told and skills he quietly passed on to his daughter during weekend hunting trips. By age 12, Sarah could consistently hit targets at 600 yards. By 16, she was making shots at distances that impressed the local hunting guides. By her 20s, she had developed techniques that went beyond anything her father had taught her. The breakthrough came during her study of atmospheric physics at Montana State University. While working toward her meteorology degree, Sarah became fascinated with how air density, temperature gradients, and microclimates affected projectile flight. She began applying scientific principles to marksmanship that most shooters learned only through trial and error. After graduation, Sarah could have pursued a career in weather forecasting or atmospheric research. Instead, she returned to the family ranch when her parents died in a car accident. The land had been in her father's family for 3 generations, and abandoning it felt like betraying everything he had taught her about responsibility and commitment. Ranch life suited Sarah's temperament. Cattle ranching required patience, planning, and problem-solving skills. Predator control demanded precision shooting under real-world conditions. The isolation gave her time to refine techniques that would have been impossible to develop in crowded shooting ranges or formal training programs. Her custom rifles reflected years of experimentation. Sarah hand-loaded her ammunition, testing different powder charges and bullet weights for optimal performance at extreme ranges. She had built her own ballistic calculator, programming it with atmospheric data she collected from weather stations across the region. Her shooting logs filled dozens of notebooks with precise records of shot placement, environmental conditions, and equipment performance. The breakthrough in her technique came during a particularly difficult winter when wolves had become aggressive around her cattle. Traditional hunting methods weren't working because the pack had learned to avoid areas where humans typically waited. Sarah began studying wolf behavior patterns, tracking their movements across the ranch for weeks before attempting shots. One February morning, she spotted a wolf at an estimated distance of 1,400 yards. The animal was moving along a ridge line where shooting conditions were exceptionally difficult. Crosswind gusts, temperature inversion creating mirage effects, and snow squalls reducing visibility. Most hunters would have waited for better conditions or tried to get closer. Instead, Sarah spent 45 minutes studying the environment. She observed how wind patterns changed across the valley, noting that surface winds differed from winds at different elevations. She tracked the movement of snow particles to map air currents. She measured temperature variations using multiple thermometers placed at different locations. When she finally took the shot, Sarah had calculated not just bullet drop and wind drift, but also the Coriolis effect, air density variations, and even the slight gravitational differences caused by the valley's elevation changes. The bullet traveled for nearly 3 seconds before finding its target. The wolf dropped instantly. When Sarah hiked across the valley to confirm the shot, she found that her bullet had struck within 2 inches of where she had aimed. For a 1,400-yard shot under those conditions, such precision should have been impossible. But Sarah wasn't satisfied with impossible shots made under lucky circumstances. She began deliberately challenging herself with increasingly difficult scenarios. Shooting in rain, snow, and fog. Making precise shots just before sunrise when light conditions created optical illusions. Taking aim at targets during temperature transitions when atmospheric conditions changed rapidly. Her most ambitious project involved mapping atmospheric conditions across her entire valley throughout different seasons. Sarah installed weather monitoring equipment at 23 different locations, creating a detailed picture of how air moved through the landscape. This data allowed her to predict wind patterns and atmospheric effects with unprecedented accuracy. The local hunting community gradually became aware of Sarah's abilities. Guides began asking her advice about difficult shots. Visiting hunters requested demonstrations of her techniques. Word spread through Montana's tight-knit shooting community that a rancher near Billings could make shots that defied conventional wisdom about long-range marksmanship. Sarah remained modest about her skills. When pressed to explain her techniques, she would demonstrate the scientific principles involved, but insisted that success came from preparation rather than natural talent. She emphasized the importance of understanding environmental conditions and stressed that spectacular shots were the result of methodical analysis rather than luck or intuition. Her reputation reached beyond Montana when a wildlife photographer documenting predator control methods witnessed Sarah make a series of shots that seemed impossible. The photographer, James Martinez, had spent years documenting hunting practices across the American West. He had observed military snipers, competitive marksmen, and experienced hunters, but nothing had prepared him for Sarah's level of precision under field conditions. Martinez convinced Sarah to allow him to document her techniques for a magazine article about scientific approaches to marksmanship. The resulting photographs and detailed descriptions of her methods caught the attention of competitive shooting organizations across the country. The first formal invitation came from the Precision Rifle Association. They wanted Sarah to participate in a demonstration event featuring the country's most accomplished long-range shooters. Sarah initially declined, explaining that her techniques were developed for practical ranch work rather than competition. But Martinez convinced her that sharing her methods could help other shooters improve their skills and advance the sport of precision marksmanship. Sarah agreed to participate in one event, with the understanding that she would demonstrate her techniques, but not compete for prizes or recognition. The event was scheduled for September 2019 at a private shooting facility in Colorado. The location had been chosen because it offered shooting distances up to 2,000 yards and challenging environmental conditions that would test every participant's skills. 24 shooters would participate, including current and former military snipers, competitive champions, and renowned hunting guides. Sarah arrived at the facility 3 days before the event to study the terrain and environmental conditions. The shooting range was located in a high mountain valley where altitude, temperature variations, and unpredictable wind patterns created some of the most challenging conditions she had ever encountered. While other participants practiced on the range and tested their equipment, Sarah spent her time mapping atmospheric conditions and studying how environmental factors affected bullet trajectory at the location. She installed temporary weather monitoring equipment and collected data about wind patterns, temperature gradients, and air density variations throughout the valley. The night before the demonstration, Sarah made final adjustments to her ballistic calculations and prepared ammunition specifically for the altitude and expected conditions. She had brought 3 different rifles, each optimized for different shooting distances and environmental scenarios. As she cleaned her equipment and reviewed her notes, Sarah reflected on how far she had come from the quiet ranch woman who just wanted to protect her cattle. Tomorrow, she would demonstrate techniques developed through years of solitary practice to some of the most accomplished shooters in the country. But Sarah had no idea that the next day would involve conditions so challenging that even she would question whether success was possible. The weather forecast predicted fog, wind, and visibility conditions that would make precise shooting at extreme distances seem like pure fantasy. What happened the following morning would force the shooting community to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the limits of human marksmanship. And it would begin with Sarah making a decision that every other shooter at the facility considered completely impossible. The morning of September 15th began with conditions that would have sent most shooters back to their hotels. Thick fog rolled through the mountain valley, reducing visibility to less than 200 yards. Wind gusts reached 30 miles per hour, shifting direction unpredictably as air currents bounced off the surrounding peaks. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees overnight, creating dense air that would significantly affect bullet trajectory. At the shooting facility, 23 of the invited marksmen gathered in the heated lodge, drinking coffee and waiting for conditions to improve. These were not casual shooters discouraged by challenging weather. The group included Marcus Thompson, a former Navy SEAL sniper with confirmed kills at over 1,500 yards in Afghanistan. Rebecca Martinez had won the National Long Range Championship 3 consecutive years. David Chun was a renowned hunting guide whose clients included military leaders and Fortune 500 executives seeking to test their skills on extreme hunts. All of them agreed that attempting precision shots under current conditions would be pointless. The fog alone made target acquisition impossible beyond 300 yards. The wind conditions would create bullet drift that even the most sophisticated ballistic computers couldn't accurately predict. Professional shooters knew when environmental factors made success impossible, and today appeared to be one of those days. Sarah Chun stood apart from the group, studying weather data on her tablet and making notes in a small leather notebook. While others complained about the conditions, she was analyzing them. The fog wasn't uniform. It moved in patterns influenced by temperature gradients and wind currents. The seemingly chaotic wind actually followed predictable paths as it flowed through the valley's topography. James Martinez, the photographer who had documented Sarah's techniques in Montana, watched her preparation process with fascination. He had spent 3 days observing the other shooters and understood that their frustration was justified. The conditions were genuinely challenging by any reasonable standard. But Sarah's approach to environmental challenges was unlike anything Martinez had witnessed. Where other shooters saw obstacles, she saw variables to be measured and calculated. Her weather monitoring equipment had collected data throughout the night, providing detailed information about atmospheric conditions across the entire valley. At 8:30 a.m., range officials announced that formal demonstrations would be postponed until afternoon, hoping that conditions would improve. Most participants returned to their rooms or headed to the facility's indoor training areas. A few veterans decided to practice on shorter-range targets that remained visible through the fog. Sarah approached the range master, a former Marine named Colonel William Hayes who had organized the event. She requested permission to attempt shots at the facility's longest-distance targets. explaining that she wanted to test her techniques under challenging conditions. Colonel Hayes initially refused. The facility's 1,800-yard targets were completely invisible in the current fog. Even the 1,200-yard markers couldn't be seen clearly. Attempting shots at invisible targets seemed reckless and potentially dangerous. Sarah explained her approach methodically. She had mapped the valley's topography and atmospheric conditions. Her ballistic calculations accounted for current environmental factors. Most importantly, she wasn't shooting blind. She was using scientific principles to predict exactly where bullets would travel under these specific conditions. The conversation attracted attention from other shooters. Marcus Thompson approached the group, curious about Sarah's confidence in seemingly impossible conditions. Rebecca Martinez joined them, followed by several other participants who wanted to understand what Sarah believed she could accomplish. Colonel Hayes remained skeptical, but agreed to allow Sarah to attempt one demonstration shot, with strict safety protocols. The target would be the facility's 1,847-yard steel plate, located on a hillside across the valley. Multiple spotters would be positioned to ensure safety, though visibility was so poor that they couldn't actually see the target area. Sarah spent the next hour preparing for the shot. She assembled her custom rifle, a precision instrument she had built specifically for extreme-range shooting under difficult conditions. The rifle featured a heavy barrel designed to minimize the effects of wind and temperature variations. The scope was a high-magnification model with specialized reticles for calculating holdover and windage adjustments. Her ammunition was hand-loaded with powder charges calculated for the current altitude and atmospheric conditions. Each cartridge was identical, prepared with precision that exceeded military specification ammunition. Sarah had tested this specific load extensively, documenting its performance under hundreds of different environmental scenarios. While Sarah prepared her equipment, word spread throughout the facility that someone was actually going to attempt a shot in the fog. Participants gathered near the shooting position, most expecting to witness an embarrassing failure. A few veterans made quiet bets about how far off target the shot would be, assuming it was even possible to determine where the bullet landed. David Chun, the hunting guide, watched Sarah's preparation process with professional interest. He recognized the methodical approach of someone who had spent years developing specialized techniques. But he remained convinced that no amount of preparation could overcome the environmental factors they were facing. Sarah's final preparations involved consulting multiple data sources. Weather instruments provided real-time information about wind speed and direction at various elevations. Her tablet displayed ballistic calculations that incorporated atmospheric pressure, temperature, humidity, and air density measurements. A handheld device measured the exact distance to the target using laser technology. At 10:15 a.m., Sarah announced that she was ready to attempt the shot. Colonel Hayes verified that all safety protocols were in place and confirmed that spotters were positioned appropriately. The gathered marksmen fell silent, recognizing that they were about to witness either an extraordinary demonstration of skill or a spectacular failure. Sarah positioned herself behind her rifle and began the final phase of her shooting sequence. Through her scope, the target area was completely invisible, lost in dense fog. She was aiming at a steel plate she couldn't see, located nearly 2,000 yards away, in wind conditions that were constantly changing. But Sarah wasn't relying on visual target acquisition. Her calculations told her exactly where the target was located relative to her position. Environmental data provided precise information about atmospheric conditions affecting bullet trajectory. Years of experience had taught her to trust scientific analysis over visual confirmation. The rifle's report echoed across the valley, a sharp crack that cut through the morning stillness. The sound faded quickly, absorbed by the fog and surrounding hills. For several seconds, nothing happened. The gathered shooters waited, straining to hear any indication that the bullet had found its target. Then came a distant metallic clang, the unmistakable sound of a bullet striking steel. The sound was clear and immediate, indicating a direct hit rather than a near miss. In the fog-shrouded valley, that metallic ring was the only evidence that Sarah's shot had found its intended target. The gathered marksmen erupted in surprised exclamations. Marcus Thompson shook his head in disbelief, muttering that what he had just witnessed shouldn't have been possible. Rebecca Martinez demanded to know how Sarah had calculated wind drift without being able to observe environmental conditions of the target. Sarah remained calm, already beginning to clean her rifle as if nothing unusual had happened. When pressed to explain her technique, she offered to share her environmental data and ballistic calculations. The numbers told the story of careful preparation and scientific analysis rather than lucky guesswork. Colonel Hayes organized a group to hike across the valley and verify the shot placement. The fog was beginning to lift slightly, making the journey possible though still challenging. Sarah joined the verification team, bringing her measuring equipment to document the precise impact location. The hike across the valley took 45 minutes through difficult terrain. As they approached the target area, the fog thinned enough to reveal the steel plate mounted on its stand. From 100 yards away, they could see a bright silver mark on the dark steel surface, indicating recent bullet impact. Closer inspection revealed that Sarah's bullet had struck the target within 3 inches of the center scoring ring. For a shot attempted under those conditions, such accuracy was unprecedented. Several witnesses measured the impact location multiple times, documenting the results with photographs and precise measurements. Marcus Thompson examined the impact crater with professional interest. As a former military sniper, he understood the technical difficulty of what Sarah had accomplished. The shot had required calculations that went far beyond standard ballistic tables. Environmental factors had been predicted and compensated for with mathematical precision that exceeded anything he had seen in military training. During the hike back to the shooting position, Sarah explained her methodology to the increasingly fascinated group. Her approach combined atmospheric physics, advanced ballistic calculation, and environmental monitoring techniques that most shooters had never considered. What appeared to be an impossible shot was actually the result of careful scientific analysis. Word of Sarah's successful shot spread rapidly through the shooting community. By afternoon, participants who had missed the morning demonstration were requesting to observe additional attempts. Online forums buzzed with discussions about the technique Sarah had employed and speculation about the limits of precision marksmanship. But Sarah's demonstration was far from over. The morning fog shot had been impressive, but it was only the beginning of what she planned to show the gathered experts. As conditions continued to change throughout the day, she would face even more challenging scenarios that would test the absolute limits of her scientific approach to marksmanship. The afternoon would bring wind conditions that shifted constantly, creating atmospheric turbulence that made ballistic prediction extremely difficult. Sarah would need to demonstrate that her success wasn't based on luck or favorable conditions, but on techniques that could consistently produce extraordinary results under any circumstances. As they returned to the shooting facility, none of the witnesses could have predicted that Sarah's most impressive demonstration was still ahead of them. The shot that would truly redefine the limits of human precision was waiting for conditions that wouldn't arrive until the following morning. News of Sarah's fog shot traveled through the competitive shooting world faster than anyone expected. By late afternoon, phone calls and messages were flooding the facility. Professional marksmen from across the country wanted details about the techniques Sarah had demonstrated. Military training instructors requested information about her ballistic calculation methods. Equipment manufacturers inquired about the specifications of her custom rifle and ammunition. Colonel Hayes found himself managing an unexpected media event. What had been planned as a quiet demonstration for invited participants was becoming a significant moment in the evolution of precision marksmanship. He arranged for additional documentation of Sarah's techniques, understanding that the shooting community would demand detailed analysis of her methods. Sarah remained uncomfortable with the attention. She had agreed to demonstrate her techniques to help advance the sport, but the growing interest felt overwhelming. When Martinez suggested that equipment manufacturers might want to sponsor her or that competitive shooting organizations might offer lucrative contracts, Sarah politely declined all discussions about commercializing her skills. Her focus remained on the technical aspects of what she was trying to accomplish. The morning's successful shot in fog had validated her environmental analysis techniques, but Sarah knew that truly challenging conditions lay ahead. Weather forecasts predicted that the following day would bring atmospheric disturbances that would create the most difficult shooting conditions possible. That evening, participants gathered in the facility's main lodge for dinner and informal discussions about marksmanship techniques. The conversation inevitably focused on Sarah's demonstration and the scientific principles underlying her approach. Several military veterans shared stories about challenging shots they had made under combat conditions, but acknowledged that none of their experiences compared to shooting accurately at invisible targets. Rebecca Martinez, the three-time national champion, spent considerable time questioning Sarah about her ballistic calculation methods. As a competitive shooter, Martinez understood the mathematical principles involved in long-range shooting, but Sarah's techniques went far beyond standard approaches used in formal competition. Traditional competitive shooting took place under controlled conditions with known distances, predictable wind patterns, and optimal visibility. Sarah's methods were designed for real-world scenarios where environmental factors were constantly changing and shooting conditions were far from ideal. The gap between competition marksmanship and practical field shooting was wider than most people realized. David Chun, the hunting guide, was particularly interested in Sarah's approach to predator control. His clients often requested hunts that involved challenging shots under difficult conditions, but he had never encountered techniques that could produce consistent accuracy under the extreme environmental factors Sarah routinely faced. Sarah explained that her scientific approach had developed out of necessity rather than academic interest. Ranch life demanded practical solutions to real problems. Predator control couldn't wait for ideal shooting conditions, and missed shots meant continued livestock losses. Her techniques had evolved through years of facing situations where precision was essential regardless of environmental challenges. As the evening progressed, Sarah shared more details about her background and the development of her shooting skills. Her father's military training had provided the foundation, but her university studies in atmospheric physics had enabled innovations that went beyond traditional marksmanship instruction. The combination of practical necessity and scientific knowledge had created techniques that no one had systematically developed before. Marcus Thompson, the former Navy SEAL, found himself reconsidering assumptions he had held throughout his military career. SEAL sniper training emphasized adaptability and precision under combat stress, but it didn't include the level of environmental analysis that Sarah routinely employed. Military snipers learned to compensate for atmospheric factors through experience and established procedures, but Sarah's approach involved real-time calculation of variables that military training treated as fixed factors. The conversation continued past midnight, with participants sharing experiences and questioning Sarah about specific aspects of her methodology. She patiently answered technical questions and demonstrated calculation techniques, but repeatedly emphasized that her success came from systematic preparation rather than natural talent or lucky circumstances. The next morning brought the atmospheric conditions Sarah had been anticipating. Temperature inversion created severe mirage effects that made visual target acquisition extremely difficult even in clear air. Wind patterns were erratic and constantly changing as air masses with different temperatures and densities interacted across the valley. Barometric pressure was fluctuating rapidly due to an approaching weather front. Most of the participants looked at the conditions and immediately decided that meaningful shooting demonstrations would be impossible. The combination of optical distortion from temperature gradients and unpredictable wind patterns created an environment where even experienced marksmen couldn't accurately predict bullet trajectory. Sarah studied the atmospheric data with intense concentration. The conditions were more challenging than anything she had faced on her ranch, but they followed physical principles that could be analyzed and predicted. The complexity was greater, but the underlying science remained the same. She spent 2 hours collecting environmental data and running ballistic calculations. The mathematical models required constant adjustment as atmospheric conditions continued to change, but patterns were beginning to emerge. Temperature inversion was creating predictable air density variations. Wind patterns, while complex, were following topographical features in ways that could be mapped and anticipated. At 10:30 a.m., Sarah announced that she wanted to attempt a shot at the facility's maximum distance target, a steel plate located 2,134 yards away on a distant hillside. The target was barely visible even with high magnification optics due to mirage effects, and atmospheric conditions were changing so rapidly that ballistic calculations would need constant updating. Colonel Hayes was reluctant to authorize the attempt. The previous day's fog shot had been impressive, but current conditions were arguably more challenging. The combination of visual distortion and atmospheric turbulence created factors that couldn't be easily predicted or compensated for. But Sarah's systematic approach to environmental analysis had impressed everyone who had observed it. Her methodology was based on scientific principles rather than guesswork, and her track record suggested that she understood atmospheric factors better than anyone else at the facility. Permission was granted with the understanding that this would be Sarah's most challenging demonstration. Multiple spotters were positioned across the valley to observe the shot and provide feedback about bullet trajectory. High-speed cameras were set up to document the environmental conditions and, if possible, capture the bullet's flight path. Sarah's preparation for this shot was more intensive than anything she had done previously. Environmental monitoring equipment was positioned at multiple locations to provide real-time data about atmospheric conditions across the entire bullet trajectory. Her ballistic calculator was programmed with variables that accounted for temperature gradients, air density variations, and Coriolis effects that became significant at extreme distances. The ammunition for this shot was selected from cartridges that had been prepared specifically for the current atmospheric conditions. Sarah had tested various powder charges and bullet weights, choosing a combination that would provide optimal performance in the dense air created by temperature inversion. As Sarah settled behind her rifle, the gathered observers fell silent. They understood that they were about to witness either the most impressive demonstration of marksmanship skill ever documented, or a spectacular failure that would highlight the limits of what human precision could achieve. Through her scope, Sarah could see the target area, but mirage effects made precise aiming extremely difficult. The steel plate appeared to shimmer, and dance as heat waves distorted the image. Traditional aiming techniques would have been useless under these conditions. But Sarah wasn't relying entirely on visual target acquisition. Her calculations provided exact coordinates for the target location, and her scope was calibrated to translate those coordinates into precise aiming points. Environmental data allowed her to predict exactly how atmospheric factors would affect bullet trajectory over the 2,134-yard distance. The mathematical complexity of the shot was extraordinary. Sarah was calculating bullet drop over a distance of more than a mile, accounting for wind drift that would vary at different elevations along the trajectory. Air density variations caused by temperature inversion would affect bullet velocity and trajectory curvature. Even the rotation of the Earth became a factor at such extreme distances. At 11:47 a.m., Sarah took a deep breath and began her final aiming sequence. Her rifle was pointed at what appeared to be empty air several feet above and to the side of the barely visible target. To observers, it looked like she was aiming at nothing, but her calculations indicated that the bullet would follow a precise arc through the atmosphere to arrive exactly where the target was located. The rifle fired with a sharp report that echoed across the valley. The bullet began a journey that would take nearly 4 seconds to complete, traveling through air masses with different temperatures and densities, fighting wind currents that changed direction and intensity along its path. For 4 long seconds, nothing happened. The gathered marksmen held their breath, waiting for any indication that the bullet had reached its destination. At extreme distances, even the sound of impact could take several seconds to travel back to the shooting position. Then came the sound every shooter was hoping for, a clear, unmistakable clang as the bullet struck steel. The impact sound was immediate and definitive, indicating not just a hit, but a solid center target strike. The response from the gathered experts was immediate and overwhelming. Marcus Thompson stood up and began applauding, followed quickly by every other participant. Rebecca Martinez shook her head in amazement, acknowledging that she had just witnessed something that redefined her understanding of what was possible in precision marksmanship. But the most significant reaction came from Colonel Hayes, who had spent his military career around the world's most accomplished marksman. In 30 years of experience with military snipers, competitive champions, and specialized shooting units, he had never seen anything approaching the level of precision Sarah had just demonstrated. The verification team that hiked to the distant target found Sarah's bullet had struck within 2 inches of the target center. Under the atmospheric conditions present that morning, such accuracy should have been impossible. The shot represented a level of precision that challenged fundamental assumptions about the limits of human marksmanship capability. As word of the 2,134-yard shot spread through the shooting community, Sarah found herself at the center of a discussion that would reshape competitive marksmanship, military training, and hunting practices. But she had no idea that her most legendary shot was still ahead of her, waiting for conditions that would arrive with the next morning's weather. The news of Sarah's 2,134-yard shot reached the broader shooting community within hours. Online forums exploded with discussions about the techniques she had demonstrated. Videos of the atmospheric conditions and the resulting target impact were shared thousands of times across social media platforms. Equipment manufacturers began contacting the facility, hoping to learn about the specifications of Sarah's custom rifle and ammunition. But the attention created an unexpected problem. Media outlets picked up the story, and by evening, news crews were requesting interviews and demonstrations. Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the commercial interest her shooting had generated. Equipment sponsors offered contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Television producers wanted to create shows featuring her techniques. Book publishers inquired about publishing her shooting methods. Sarah declined all commercial opportunities. Her techniques had been developed for practical ranch work, and she had no interest in commercializing skills that were tools for everyday life rather than entertainment or marketing opportunities. She agreed to continue demonstrating her methods for the educational benefit of the shooting community, but refused to profit from abilities she considered simply part of her professional responsibilities. That evening, weather reports predicted that the following morning would bring the most challenging atmospheric conditions of the entire event. A major weather front was approaching, creating temperature gradients and wind patterns that would make precision shooting at any significant distance extremely difficult. Most of the participants expected that formal demonstrations would be canceled under such conditions. Sarah spent the evening studying meteorological data and preparing for conditions that would test the absolute limits of her scientific approach. The approaching weather system would create atmospheric turbulence unlike anything she had encountered on a ranch. Wind speeds would exceed 40 miles per hour with unpredictable direction changes. Temperature variations would create severe optical distortion effects. The mathematical complexity of shooting under such conditions was staggering. Sarah worked until after midnight, programming her ballistic calculator with variables that accounted for atmospheric factors most shooters never considered. Her preparation involved weather modeling techniques typically used by meteorologists rather than marksmen. Colonel Hayes approached Sarah privately to discuss the following day's plans. The weather forecast suggested conditions that would be dangerous for any shooting activities. Winds strong enough to affect shooter stability and visibility conditions that would make target acquisition impossible seemed to eliminate any possibility of meaningful demonstrations. Sarah requested permission to attempt one final shot under the challenging conditions, explaining that she wanted to test whether her scientific approach could overcome environmental factors at the absolute limits of what atmospheric physics would allow. She acknowledged that success would be unlikely, but emphasized that advancing marksmanship technique required testing methods under extreme scenarios. The conversation revealed the fundamental difference between Sarah's approach and traditional marksmanship philosophy. Most shooters learn to avoid challenging conditions or wait for environmental factors to improve. Sarah's techniques were specifically designed to achieve precision when conditions seemed to make accuracy impossible. Colonel Hayes agreed to allow the attempt with extensive safety precautions and the understanding that this would be Sarah's final demonstration at the facility. The conditions would be too dangerous for multiple attempts, and other participants would not be permitted to shoot under such circumstances. The morning of September 17th arrived with weather that exceeded the most pessimistic forecasts. Wind gusts reached 45 miles per hour with direction changes that occurred every few seconds. Temperature differences between air masses created optical distortion, so severe that even nearby objects appeared to shimmer and move. Barometric pressure was dropping rapidly as the storm front approached. At the facility, participants gathered in the lodge to wait out the weather. Several veterans with decades of shooting experience commented that they had never seen atmospheric conditions that would make precision shooting more difficult. The combination of extreme wind, optical distortion, and atmospheric instability created an environment where even basic target identification was challenging. Sarah arrived at the facility at dawn, carrying equipment she hadn't used in previous demonstrations. Additional weather monitoring instruments would provide real-time data about atmospheric conditions across multiple elevations. A specialized wind meter could measure air movement at distances up to 1,000 yards. Her ballistic calculator had been upgraded with software that could process atmospheric variables in real time. The target Sarah selected for her final demonstration was the facility's most distant steel plate, a target located 2,247 yards away on a ridge that was barely visible even under optimal conditions. Under current weather conditions, the target was completely invisible due to atmospheric distortion and reduced visibility. Colonel Hayes questioned whether attempting a shot at an invisible target under such extreme conditions could provide any meaningful demonstration of marksmanship skill. The environmental factors were so severe that success would seem to depend more on luck than technique, regardless of the level of preparation involved. Sarah's response revealed the philosophy underlying her approach to precision shooting. She explained that her techniques were designed specifically for situations where traditional methods would fail. The purpose wasn't to demonstrate shooting under ideal conditions, but to show that scientific analysis could produce accuracy when environmental factors seemed to make precision impossible. The preparation for this shot required 3 hours of intensive environmental analysis. Sarah deployed weather monitoring equipment across the valley to map atmospheric conditions along the entire bullet trajectory. Wind measurements were taken at multiple elevations to understand how air movement varied with altitude. Temperature readings provided data about air density variations that would affect bullet velocity. Her ballistic calculations incorporated variables that most shooters had never considered. The Coriolis effect became significant at distances exceeding 2,000 yards. Air density variations caused by temperature gradients would create trajectory curvature that standard ballistic tables couldn't predict. Wind drift calculations required real-time analysis of atmospheric conditions that were constantly changing. The ammunition Sarah selected for this shot represented the culmination of years of development work. Each cartridge was loaded with powder charges calculated for the specific atmospheric conditions present that morning. Bullet weight and design had been optimized for ballistic performance under extreme weather scenarios. As Sarah prepared for the shot, word spread through the facility that she was attempting to hit a target at nearly 2,250 yards under the worst conditions anyone had ever witnessed. Participants gathered despite the weather, understanding that they might witness either the most extraordinary demonstration of marksmanship skill ever documented, or a dramatic illustration of the limits beyond which human precision could not extend. Through her scope, Sarah could see nothing but distorted air and optical illusions created by temperature gradients. The target was completely invisible, lost in atmospheric turbulence that made even approximate ranging impossible using traditional methods. She was aiming at coordinates calculated through mathematical analysis rather than visual target acquisition. The wind conditions were so severe that Sarah had to time her shot to coincide with momentary lulls in the gusting. Her ballistic calculator indicated that wind drift under current conditions would exceed 15 feet over the bullet's trajectory. Compensating for such extreme environmental factors required calculations that pushed atmospheric physics to theoretical limits. At 11:23 a.m., during a brief reduction in wind intensity, Sarah took the shot that would become legendary in marksmanship circles. Her rifle was pointed at what appeared to be empty air, aimed according to coordinates that existed only in her ballistic calculations. To observers, it looked like she was shooting at nothing, trusting mathematics over visual confirmation. The bullet began a journey through atmospheric conditions that would challenge every aspect of Sarah's scientific approach to marksmanship. Wind currents would push the projectile in multiple directions during its flight. Air density variations would alter its velocity and trajectory curvature. Temperature gradients would create forces that no ballistic table had ever been designed to predict. For nearly 5 seconds, the gathered marksmen waited in silence. The extreme distance meant that even sound would take time to travel back from the target area. Under the atmospheric conditions present that morning, there was considerable doubt that any impact sound would be audible even if the shot had somehow found its target. Then, cutting through the wind and weather noise, came the unmistakable metallic clang of a bullet striking steel. The sound was clear and immediate, indicating not just impact but a solid hit on the target. In conditions that had seemed to make precision shooting impossible, Sarah had achieved what appeared to be perfect accuracy at a distance exceeding 2,200 yards. The response from the gathered experts was unlike anything that had occurred during the previous demonstrations. These were not casual observers impressed by novelty, but professional marksmen who understood exactly how impossible what they had just witnessed should have been. Marcus Thompson, the former SEAL sniper, stood in stunned silence for several seconds before beginning to applaud. Rebecca Martinez, who had spent years pushing the boundaries of competitive marksmanship, openly admitted that Sarah's shot had redefined her understanding of what human precision could achieve. David Chun, the hunting guide, acknowledged that he had witnessed something that would change how he approached challenging shots for the rest of his career. But perhaps the most significant response came from Colonel Hayes, who had organized the event to showcase advances in marksmanship technique. In his military experience, he had observed shooting demonstrations by the world's most elite units under controlled conditions. What Sarah had accomplished under impossible circumstances exceeded anything he had seen in decades of involvement with precision shooting. The verification team that eventually reached the distant target found that Sarah's bullet had struck within 4 inches of the target center. Under the extreme atmospheric conditions present that morning, such accuracy defied conventional understanding of ballistic physics. The shot represented precision that seemed to transcend the normal limitations of equipment, environment, and human capability. As news of the 2,247-yard shot spread through professional shooting circles, Sarah's techniques became the subject of intense study and analysis. Military training programs began incorporating her environmental analysis methods. Competitive shooting organizations revised their understanding of what atmospheric conditions made precision possible. Equipment manufacturers started developing instruments based on her approach to real-time ballistic calculation. But for Sarah, the most important aspect of the demonstration was not the extraordinary distance or the challenging conditions. It was the validation that scientific principles could consistently produce precision under circumstances where traditional methods failed. Her techniques proved that marksmanship could evolve beyond intuition and experience to become a discipline based on measurable, predictable atmospheric science. As the weather front passed and conditions began to improve, Sarah prepared to return to her quiet ranch in Montana. The attention and recognition felt overwhelming, but she had accomplished what she had set out to do. The shooting community now understood that precision marksmanship could achieve levels of accuracy that had previously been considered impossible. However, what Sarah didn't know was that her most legendary shot was still ahead of her. The demonstration that would become the defining moment of her career was waiting for a set of circumstances that wouldn't occur until just before her departure from the facility. The morning after Sarah's impossible 2,247-yard shot, the shooting facility buzzed with activity that had nothing to do with marksmanship demonstrations. Equipment manufacturers, military representatives, and media personnel had arrived throughout the night, all hoping to witness or document Sarah's techniques before she returned to Montana. Sarah found the commercial attention overwhelming and intrusive. Representatives from major rifle manufacturers offered substantial contracts for her to endorse their products. Military contractors wanted to hire her as a consultant for sniper training programs. Television networks proposed reality shows featuring her shooting abilities. All of these opportunities required her to commercialize skills she considered simply part of her ranching responsibilities. By mid-morning, Sarah had declined every commercial proposal and was preparing to leave the facility. She had accomplished her original goal of demonstrating that scientific principles could advance marksmanship technique. The shooting community now understood that precision was possible under environmental conditions previously considered impossible. Colonel Hayes approached Sarah as she loaded her equipment into her truck. He expressed gratitude for her demonstrations and acknowledged that her techniques would influence marksmanship training for years to come. But he also mentioned a final request that he hadn't been able to ask earlier due to the commercial chaos surrounding her previous shots. A group of young military snipers from nearby Fort Carson had been following reports about Sarah's demonstrations. These were newly graduated soldiers who had completed basic sniper training but hadn't yet been deployed overseas. They wanted to understand how Sarah's scientific approach might enhance their military effectiveness and potentially save lives in combat situations. The request presented a different consideration than the commercial opportunities Sarah had been rejecting. These were soldiers who might face life-or-death situations where precision shooting could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Her techniques could provide capabilities that might protect American forces in hostile environments. Sarah agreed to meet with the young snipers, but only on condition that no commercial representatives or media personnel would be present. This would be purely educational interaction between professionals who shared a commitment to precision and responsibility rather than profit or entertainment. The 6 soldiers who arrived at the facility that afternoon represented the newest generation of military marksmen. They had completed advanced training at some of the best sniper schools in the world, but their education had focused on traditional techniques and established procedures rather than the innovative approaches Sarah had developed. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez led the group. He had graduated at the top of his sniper school class and was scheduled for deployment to a region where long-range precision would be essential for force protection. The environmental conditions he would face overseas included extreme heat, unpredictable wind patterns, and atmospheric disturbances that would challenge every aspect of his training. Sarah spent 2 hours explaining her scientific approach to environmental analysis and ballistic calculation. She demonstrated the weather monitoring techniques that allowed her to predict atmospheric conditions along extended bullet trajectories. The soldiers were particularly interested in her real-time ballistic calculation methods and her approach to compensating for environmental factors that military training treated as fixed variables. The educational session revealed fundamental differences between military sniper training and Sarah's ranch-developed techniques. Military instruction emphasized consistency and proven procedures that would work reliably under combat stress. Sarah's methods required extensive calculation and environmental analysis that might be impractical under battlefield conditions. But the young snipers also recognized that Sarah's techniques could provide capabilities that would be valuable in specific scenarios. Long-range precision under challenging environmental conditions could enable missions that would otherwise be impossible. The ability to make accurate shots when traditional methods failed could provide tactical advantages in situations where conventional approaches wouldn't succeed. As the afternoon educational session concluded, weather conditions began changing in ways that created a unique opportunity. The storm front that had passed earlier was generating atmospheric effects that Sarah had never encountered. Temperature inversion was creating optical distortion more severe than anything she had experienced on her ranch. Wind patterns were stable, but running at consistent speeds that exceeded 50 miles per hour. The combination of extreme but predictable environmental factors presented the ultimate test of Sarah's scientific approach. Conditions were more challenging than anything she had faced, but they followed physical principles that could be analyzed and calculated. The mathematical complexity would be extraordinary, but the underlying physics remained consistent with her established techniques. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez mentioned that one of their training scenarios involved precision shooting under extreme environmental conditions similar to what they might encounter in desert deployments. The current atmospheric situation provided an opportunity to test whether Sarah's techniques could produce results under conditions that would challenge even the most advanced military equipment. Sarah realized that this presented a chance to demonstrate her methods under the most extreme circumstances possible, while providing valuable learning for soldiers who might depend on precision shooting for survival. The educational value would be significant, and the demonstration would occur without commercial exploitation or media sensationalism. The target selected for this final demonstration was not on the facility's official range. Located on a distant peak nearly 3 miles away was a large boulder that served as a natural landmark. The distance was approximately 4,900 yards, nearly 3 miles of open terrain with altitude changes, wind corridors, and atmospheric conditions that would create ballistic challenges unlike anything previously attempted. Colonel Hayes initially refused to authorize an attempt at such an extreme distance. No documented precision rifle shot had ever been successfully made at nearly 3 miles under any circumstances, much less under the severe environmental conditions currently present. The attempt would push beyond the theoretical limits of both equipment and atmospheric physics. But Sarah's systematic approach to environmental analysis had consistently produced results that exceeded conventional expectations. Her techniques were specifically designed to achieve precision when conditions seemed to make accuracy impossible. The young soldiers would benefit from observing how scientific principles could be applied under the most extreme scenarios they might encounter. Permission was granted with extensive safety precautions and the understanding that this would be purely educational rather than a formal demonstration. Multiple spotters were positioned along the valley to observe bullet trajectory if possible. High-powered optics were focused on the distant target area to confirm impact if the shot somehow succeeded. Sarah's preparation for this attempt required 4 hours of intensive environmental analysis. Weather monitoring equipment was deployed across the entire valley to map atmospheric conditions along the extended bullet trajectory. Wind measurements were taken at multiple elevations and distances to understand air movement patterns across the nearly 3-mile distance. The ballistic calculations involved mathematical complexity that pushed her equipment to operational limits. At distances approaching 5,000 yards, factors like Earth's rotation became significant variables. Air density variations caused by altitude changes would create trajectory effects that no standard ballistic table could predict. Wind drift calculations required analysis of atmospheric data across terrain features that would influence air movement in complex ways. Her custom rifle was functioning at the absolute limits of its design capabilities. The precision required for accuracy at such distances exceeded the tolerances of conventional manufacturing. Sarah's hand-loaded ammunition represented years of development work, optimized for ballistic performance under the specific conditions present that afternoon. As Sarah prepared for the shot, the young soldiers observed every aspect of her technique. They recognized that they were witnessing an approach to marksmanship that went far beyond anything covered in military training. The level of scientific analysis and environmental calculation required for such extreme precision would influence how they thought about their profession for the rest of their careers. Through her scope, the distant boulder was barely visible as a tiny speck against the mountainside. At nearly 3 miles distance, atmospheric distortion made precise aiming impossible using traditional methods. Sarah was relying entirely on mathematical calculation and coordinate-based targeting rather than visual confirmation. At 4:47 p.m., under conditions that made precision shooting seem impossible at any significant distance, Sarah attempted the longest documented rifle shot ever made under real-world environmental conditions. Her rifle was pointed according to calculations that incorporated atmospheric variables most marksmen never considered. The bullet would travel for nearly 8 seconds through air masses with different temperatures, densities, and movement patterns. For 8 seconds that seemed like minutes, absolute silence prevailed across the valley. Even the young soldiers who had witnessed precision shooting under controlled training conditions understood that they might be observing either the most extraordinary demonstration of marksmanship ever documented, or a dramatic illustration of the limits beyond which human precision could not extend. Then, across nearly 3 miles of open terrain and severe atmospheric disturbance, came the unmistakable sound of impact. Not the metallic clang of bullets striking steel, but the sharp crack of high-velocity impact on stone. The sound was distant, but clear, indicating that Sarah's bullet had found its intended target against odds that defied mathematical calculation. The verification of this shot required a helicopter flight to the distant peak, something that wouldn't occur until the following morning. But the impact sound had been witnessed by multiple observers using high-powered optics, and the trajectory had been tracked by spotters positioned across the valley. When confirmation came the next day, it revealed that Sarah's bullet had struck within 18 inches of her intended aim point on a distant boulder. At a distance of 4,923 yards under extreme atmospheric conditions, such accuracy represented precision that challenged fundamental assumptions about the limits of human marksmanship capability. The young soldiers returned to Fort Carson with an understanding that marksmanship could achieve levels of precision that exceeded anything covered in their military training. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez later credited Sarah's techniques with saving lives during his deployment overseas, where her environmental analysis methods enabled successful missions under conditions that would have made traditional approaches ineffective. But, for Sarah, the most important result was not the extraordinary distance or the impossible conditions. It was the knowledge that her techniques could provide capabilities that might protect soldiers in life-or-death situations. Her scientific approach to marksmanship had evolved from practical ranch work into methods that could enhance military effectiveness and potentially save American lives. As Sarah drove back to her ranch in Montana, she reflected on how her quiet life had been transformed by 3 days of demonstrations. The shooting community would study her techniques for years to come. Equipment manufacturers would develop instruments based on her environmental analysis methods. Military training programs would incorporate her approach to scientific marksmanship. But, perhaps most importantly, young soldiers would carry her techniques into combat situations where precision shooting could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The scientific principles she had developed for protecting cattle from predators had evolved into capabilities that could protect human lives under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Sarah's legendary status in the marksmanship community was secure, but her greatest satisfaction came from knowing that her techniques would continue advancing the science of precision shooting long after her demonstrations were forgotten. She had proven that human capability could exceed traditional limitations when scientific principles were systematically applied to practical challenges. The quiet rancher from Montana had shown the world that impossible shots were simply problems waiting for scientific solutions.